EBITDA and seller's discretionary earnings is definitely not cash
Yeah.
because there are all kinds of things hitting the balance sheet
Yeah.
that are not factored into EBITDA. The most obvious one being capital expense, but there's also changes in working capital and
Yeah.
then just other timing elements of the business. So there's also a view on what is the free cash flow of the business.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our number one priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at the independent ERP and digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. Mom and pop businesses have a mindset. They are able to manage the books, then they are good. But to build a scalable business, you need to implement the FP&A process sooner rather than later. The FP&A process can help with the forward-looking statements and plan the cash flow. It might also help in identifying the red flags from the perspective of an investor. Whether you want to raise capital, acquire a leveraged company, or sell a company. In today's episode, our guest, Reilly, discusses how to start on the FP&A process. He also describes other concepts such as why businesses need to be on 3 statement models before they can start on their FP&A journey. Finally, he discusses several other concepts such as leveraged buyouts, the importance of seller discretionary income, and the red flags that investors look for in a FP&A model. Let me introduce Chris to you, a finance expert with a diverse background encompassing consulting, corporate finance, and private equity. With a passion for private equity, he ventured into middle market private equity in Denver, refining his skills over a decade. He is an influential figure in finance, shares insights with over 85,000 LinkedIn followers, simplifying the complex realms of finance with his expertise. With that, let's get to the conversation. Hey Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sam. How's it going?
Hey, going great, man. And this is super exciting. You are almost like a celebrity on LinkedIn. I've been following you for a while. So this is such a pleasure and honor to host you.
Well, thanks. I'm very humbled to hear that. And if you saw what my life actually looked like, you might retract that statement. But thank you.
We all are in the same boat, Chris. We all are living the same life. So I mean, I know a lot of people know you on LinkedIn, but the people who might not know you, do you want to quickly introduce yourself and maybe talk about a little bit about your current focus, Chris?
Yeah, sure. So the quick one pager on me is I started
One
working
pager, I
in the
like it.
financial crisis. Yeah, right right in 2009 in New York City. Worked on the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy and kicked
Hmm.
off my working career there, and helped them like unwind the derivatives portfolio, which is a really interesting way to get started in the working world.
Yeah.
I was with FTI Consulting at the time. That's
Hmm.
how I got exposure to that engagement. And then from there, I spent some time working for Hilton Worldwide as part of their FP&A and treasury team.
Yeah.
And that was my first exposure to FP&A, even though
Yeah.
FP&A was relatively new at the time in terms of
Yeah.
like a term that people knew.
Yeah.
And then from there, they were owned by Blackstone at the time.
Yeah.
And I took up an interest in private equity while I was working for them because of
Yeah.
the Blackstone ownership. And so
Yeah.
I researched it on my own, taught myself to build LBO models in my spare time. And then we wanted to relocate out to Colorado.
Yeah.
And I was lucky enough to find a small middle market firm out here that
Yeah.
wanted to take a chance on me
Yeah.
because my background was non-traditional. I wasn't a banker or anything like that.
Yeah.
And spent the better part of my career in mid-market
Yeah.
PE doing deals kind of around like the 100 million or less range in terms
Yeah.
of revenue, sometimes higher, but not super common.
Yeah.
And then a few years ago, it's been about 3, 4 years now, in 2020, I went out on my own as an M&A FP&A contractor, and
Yeah.
basically I help those companies build financial models either for acquiring companies or if they just need an internal operating model for FP&A. And then at the same time, I started to post some content on LinkedIn, as you alluded to,
Yeah.
and I really grew my business there on the content side. And so now a big primary focus of mine is helping people with financial modeling, and I educate people on how to do that and build financial models for private equity and FP&A. And so that's my primary focus today.
That is very interesting. So we are going to peel a lot of layers. You have used some terms that some people might not know. So obviously we are going to discuss that as well. Before we do that, we have one of these standard questions that we
Sure.
ask every single guest, and that is going to be your perspective on business growth.
Yeah, well, I'd say business growth to me, I always think about a spreadsheet. That's where
Yeah.
my head goes. I'm thinking about, is the company that I'm helping model out, do they have capital or not? And what are we going to do to model out the future in order
Yeah.
to understand, does this company need to go out and raise,
Yeah.
or are they good to kind of run internally and operate? And that's a big part of the value that I bring to the clients that I help. And later stage companies, not such a big deal. They're better LBO candidates or buyouts. They cash flow nicely. Earlier stage companies, especially software startups, they're
Yeah.
always in the kind of the fundraising mindset as they
Yeah.
grow until they eventually become profitable. And so that is a big focus of my growth is how do we get a company from like a series seed or A B
Yeah.
to something more sustainable and profitable. So my brain always goes to
Okay, very interesting. So now let's go back to some of the layers that you have touched, and obviously, a large majority of our audience are going to be finance folks. So they might be familiar with LBO, but some might not. So talk about that a little bit, how LBO models work. And in our space, I guess, I mean, we also have a lot of SMB listeners. They might not even know how this whole leverage space works, how to capitalize on that. So maybe shed light into that, how mom and pop businesses, and they are probably not going to be LBO candidates, right? So talk about that, what it means if anybody wants to take advantage, and what is the process of building models for those.
Yeah, so an LBO, even though it's sounds overly complicated and frankly opaque, it stands for leveraged buyout.
Yeah.
All it means is you're going to borrow some money to buy something, and it's actually the exact same process as buying a house. What you do to buy a house is you put down a piece of equity, and the rest you borrow in the form of a mortgage or debt or leverage, and that's the term. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to use not as much equity as you
Yeah.
would need to buy the entire house. You can borrow some of that to create the purchase. And then what happens is, you live in the house and hopefully in several years the price appreciates, you can sell it, you can pay off your mortgage, and then hopefully you make a nice return on your equity. And so that's how a leveraged buyout works. In
Yeah.
the business setting, you're just doing that to buy a company.
Yeah.
So you're going to put in some equity, you're going to raise some debt,
Yeah.
usually in the form of a term loan or some other kind of debt slug, and you acquire the company. And in a house where you might renovate or repaint stuff or fix things up, in a business, what you're going to be doing is bringing some sophistication. You're going to
Yeah.
have internal reporting processes. You might be putting in an ERP. In
Yeah.
fact, a lot of times you'll be putting in an ERP, internal controls, budgeting, and trying to get the revenue and the profitability to that next level so that if you go and resell the company, then you can pay off the debt that you raised in the first place and make a return on your equity. And that's the bread and butter of private equity firms that typically do
Yeah.
later stage companies because they cash flow and because they can support the interest expense that comes along with that incremental debt. If you're a startup,
Yeah.
you're not really an LBO candidate because you're not cash flowing just yet.
Yeah.
And so usually you're going to be seeing equity investments instead of a combo debt equity.
Yeah, so very interesting. So let's talk about some of different examples that you have seen in your experience, and everybody's going to be at different stage, right? Mom and pop, again, I like to talk a lot about SMB, right? They are my favorite candidates because they have no idea how much money they are leaving on the table, and how much they can do just by utilizing the money itself, meaning something like leveraged buyout that you mentioned, right? These guys don't even have the control on their financials, I guess. And I don't know how much they really understand the ratios. If you look at the average company that is going to be probably in my space, manufacturing, retail, distribution, I don't know how many financial ratios they are going to track, to be completely honest. Okay. As long as the books are done, I think life is good. They are not getting audit, everybody's getting paid, they are happy, right? So how do you start the process? So let's say if you want to have the FP&A mindset, in your experience, you have seen some companies which you knew in your heart that they are going to do really well overall because of the maturity of the processes, right? Because FP&A is going to get them the intelligence that they are looking for from the business perspective, and that they can make the right decisions where they should be investing more, where they should not be investing. So maybe take a couple of examples and talk about, the ones that you really like and the ones that are probably going to require some work.
Yeah, I think what happens is, and you alluded to something that's important, is especially for mom and pop businesses, they will close the books. Like you said, everybody's getting paid and all things are good, and let's just kind of keep it going. The bank account has some cash in it. That's
Yeah,
great. And what FP&A brings to the table is a forward-looking mindset
yeah,
where we start to model out the projections. It doesn't have to be forever, but at least
yeah,
the next 6 or 12 months.
yeah,
And we start to say to ourselves, okay, if we do X, Y, and Z on the operating side,
yeah,
how is that going to reflect in the business financially?
yeah,
And then does that generate free cash flow for us? And if so, or if not, then what do we do again on the upside to make sure that we can create a good business? So FP&A serves as like a forward-looking scorecard
yeah,
to help, I'm using a lot of like metaphors here, but steer
yeah,
the ship for
yeah,
the right direction of where the operation team should be headed. And then ultimately, if you're going to potentially take the company out to market, or even for an SMB, if you're going to list it on Biz Buy Sell and work with a broker or something like that, you need to have a rough sense of the profitability of the company,
yeah,
as well as a calculation of the seller's discretionary earnings and the free cash flow so that a potential investor can place some kind of market value on the business. And I feel like that sophistication often is not seen until the sale process. And
yeah.
that's something that FP&A brings to the table. Or if you're going to work strictly with like a sell side broker, they can bring that to the table as well. But what you're switching from is close the books and thinking about the past and just kind of surviving another day
Yeah.
to more of a forward-looking strategy, and that's where the FP&A piece.
Okay, so very interesting. So let's say if I have a hypothetical company, they just don't know how to start on the FP&A process. They might be doing a little bit of budgeting. Everybody does some sort of budgeting, but I don't know how mature they are going to be in terms of the processes, right? So let's say if somebody wants to start on that process, what would be the journey like? Are they simply looking to augment their chart of accounts, or are they looking for some sort of forward-looking financial statements? What do they need to have in place so that they can maybe hire an expert, I guess, like you, so that you can coach them in terms of how to build these models, but they need to have some groundwork there before they can start on the process. So in your experience, I mean, when you get into any sort of engagements, in some engagements, you kind of know that these guys have put some work and my life is going to be easy because I have everything that I need and I can hit the ground running from day one. The others are going to require a little bit more hand holding, I guess. So describe these two scenarios, of any engagements that you have, where you have seen, and what specifics that they have done to make your life easy.
I think the number one thing that I look for is at least a clean chart of accounts. And I just mean
Okay.
like a QuickBooks perspective. It doesn't have to be Xero or NetSuite or anything overly sophisticated. QuickBooks is totally fine.
Yeah.
And the first thing that I like to do is make sure that somebody with a true accounting background
Yeah.
has come in and looked at the books. Now, I'm a finance person. I'm not a
Yeah.
CPA, so I don't have an accounting background.
Yeah.
What I usually look for, well, I have a background, but not a CPA. What I usually look for is to make sure the books are clean. And by that, I just mean the income statement and the balance sheet has a nice organized chart of accounts.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, that's all you need to build a budget. And if we want to ignore the balance sheet for a second, because that's a more complicated modeling process,
Yeah.
and just talk about the income statement of the revenue, the cost of goods, and the operating expenses,
Yeah.
if you could just print out all of your line by line expenses, chart of accounts, and get the history by month for even just the last year,
Yeah.
and go account by account and say, okay, here's what we did last year, and now what are we going to do for the next 12 months?
Yeah.
That's a great place to start. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to be complicated. You don't need crazy formulas. You can just punch in a lot of hard coded numbers and make estimates on revenue, cost of goods, and your expense. And at least you have a decent budget to start. And so, all else equal, that's where I would start. It gets more complicated when you factor in how to model out the balance sheet, or
Yeah.
if the business is more complicated in its accounting structure, such as software,
Yeah.
where you're modeling deferred revenue and other complications that have to flow through the balance sheet. So
Yeah.
that's where you maybe need to bring in more of an expert who knows how to do that from a forward-looking perspective. But just to get started, an income statement forecast is fine.
Yeah.
And to make it even more elemental, let's say you don't even really have a great book closing process.
Yeah.
Your bank is going to have data. Your checking account is going to have
Yeah.
data.
Yeah.
You can export that, and that's going to usually give you 2 years of history.
Yeah.
You can take a look at that and just try to group some of the transactions into buckets and build out a cash flow forecast. And in this sense, what you're doing is building the direct method.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's almost easier for owners to understand that don't want to get lost in the accounting. They just say to themselves, all right, well, I know when cash is going to come in from
Yeah.
this customer, and I'm going to plug it in that way. And you can build a cash forecast budget just by looking at the history of your bank statement and then again making reasonable guesses about the future. So I would just start there as basic as possible, and then you can get more sophisticated as you go in terms of like tracking how you actually did or building out a more sophisticated balance sheet.
Yeah, so let's talk about how do we become more sophisticated, I guess, and what is going to be the process for that. So let's say if we build out the first model, how do we go to the next level? And maybe, I don't know if you have some sort of maturity curve that you like to talk about. What needs to be done? So what is my step zero? So this is probably going to be step zero. Okay, what is step one, step two, step three? Talk about that.
Well, the next thing you'd want to do is get your business to the three statement model
Yeah,
level,
yeah,
which is the income statement, the balance sheet, and the statement of cash flows. And the beauty of using QuickBooks is if you can export the income statement and the balance sheet, you have everything you need to
yeah,
build the cash flow statement. And so if you can build the cash flow statement from a historical perspective, and that's
yeah,
why I always like to build it monthly, and I prefer to use 2 years of history or even three, but if you have one, that's fine.
yeah,
If you can model out the cash flow statement correctly for the history,
yeah,
then you know that if I pull forward my income statement and the balance sheet in terms of a forecast, then my cash flow statement should run automatically. And what you're building there is an indirect method three statement cash flow model.
yeah,
And now you have the sophistication that an investor is going to look for. Because in your income statement, you can model out the EBITDA projection or the seller's discretionary
yeah,
earnings, which is the piece that they're going to be looking for.
yeah,
But then from the balance sheet perspective, you can also be modeling out the capital expenditures, any debt or equity proceeds or distributions or other cash events that are going to affect the business, but that are not going to hit the income statement. And so that's why you kind of need both. And once you have that holistic view, then you really have a sophisticated model build that somebody of more like an institutional mindset is going to be looking for.
Okay, so very interesting. So let's talk about that institutional mindset. So one thing that you mentioned is the seller's discretionary income. So I don't know what they look for in that. Are they going to be looking at, are you making fair salary? If you are making too low, is that going to be a red flag? If you are making too high, is that going to be a red flag? So talk to us about a little bit more in terms of what kind of things that they look for and how they can keep it organized. So let's say if any businesses are trying to sell, they have it all there in their financial statements.
Yeah, so the primary difference between an EBITDA or a seller's discretionary earnings is really the take-home compensation to the owner. So
Yeah,
I like to think of seller's discretionary earnings as EBITDA plus owner compensation, like at
yeah,
its most basic level. And what you're doing is you're just trying to build a normalized view of the profitability of the company because most companies are purchased based on multiples of that EBITDA or the seller's discretionary earnings. And what I mean by that is if you're shopping for a house and you look around the neighborhood,
yeah,
houses are going to be compared to other houses in the area. So that's their comp set. When it comes to businesses, you're going to be looking at EBITDAs of similar companies
yeah,
and those respective margins, and then they will receive a corresponding multiple or number. They'll be multiplied by something between 4 and 10,
yeah,
basically, depending on how sophisticated the company is. So if it's a $1 million EBITDA company, at a 10x multiple, it would be a $10 million business from a
yeah,
valuation perspective. And so calculating that EBITDA or seller's discretionary earnings is the first step in getting that baseline before you can apply the multiple. And so that's the first thing that an investor is going to look for. Am I
yeah,
going to be paying a fair price? But then, and everybody loves to point this out, EBITDA and seller's discretionary earnings is definitely not cash
yeah,
because there are all kinds of things hitting the balance sheet
yeah,
that are not factored into EBITDA, the most obvious one being capital expense, but there's also changes in working capital and
yeah,
then just other timing elements of the business. So there's also a view on what is the free cash flow of the business as well, and what is my multiple on that free cash flow. And so the EBITDA multiple and the free cash flow multiple are ultimately going to be different. And so that's where the three statement model comes in and the value comes in because you can get both of those metrics in one single model and in one single month, and that's what they're looking for.
Okay, very interesting. So let's talk about some of the other topics that we wanted to hit on, and that is going to be your operational as well as, I guess, the cash flow that you wanted to talk about, the differences in those two. So maybe touch on that a little bit, how they differ, how they sort of fit in this three-statement model that you are trying to describe, if people might not know about that.
Yeah, so there's a fundamental difference, and we've touched on it a little bit. The three-statement model builds out the cash flows using the indirect method, which means it looks at the income statement and the
Yeah,
balance sheet. It does some math between periods, and it says, here's what the ending cash is going to be. If we build a cash flow forecast, that uses the direct method. And
yeah,
sometimes that's a little bit easier to think about because I just say to myself, okay, I've got this customer, and I know they're going to pay me on this date, and so I'm
yeah,
going to punch that in.
yeah,
And that's using the direct method. We've got AP going out on this, or we pay the credit card on the 5th, or something like that.
yeah,
At the end, those two models, the ending cash number should be the same, but the way that you get there is just different. In the three-statement model, you're kind of backing into it indirectly, whereas the direct method, you're actually going through and punching in the cash flows directly. But they should tie out. And so they won't always, because a three-statement model tends to be higher level in its assumptions, especially when it comes to the working capital,
yeah,
whereas a direct method cash flow is much more tactical. You're probably building it out by your AR or AP aging reports,
yeah,
and it's much more specific. And so usually a cash flow forecast is much more effective for short-term
yeah.
management in the next, 6, 12, 13 weeks, whereas a three-statement model is more effective for longer term, 1 to 3 years, that kind of thing. But the goal of them is the same, which is to target what is the ending cash flow balance as of a specific time.
Okay, so I don't know if you're going to have any sort of stories that you might be able to dig deeper, I guess, of your recent work, what you found challenging. I'm pretty sure, and I don't know how long your engagements are, to be completely honest, right? So when you get into the engagement, how's the process? Maybe describe a couple of examples.
Yeah, there's two distinct examples. So if I'm working with a software company,
Yeah,
the first thing that we're going to be doing is standing up a traditional three-statement model
yeah,
and building a longer-term projection and runway to see how much runway do they have for cash and when might they need to raise any capital, if at all. And so that's usually a 3 to 5 year model, and it's got all of the headcount information, the census information,
yeah.
and all of the revenue contracts. And what we're trying to build there is a true FP&A operating model to see when cash shortfall might come in. A different engagement where I've been working with a company like in the construction space, that one's much more project based, where cash flow can be very tricky because projects can get held up for a variety of reasons that nobody
Yeah,
can really see coming. And so you're always on top of the cash flow because your payables tend to be consistent, but your receivables tend to be very inconsistent.
yeah,
And so the modeling focus is more on day-to-day cash and less on long-term strategy. So when I talk to a client for the first time, I'm kind of understanding what is their immediate need. Is it let's get a grasp on the cash and let's build a
yeah,
forecast there, or we kind of have a sense of that, or software company might have $10 million in the bank.
yeah.
They don't need an immediate grab on cash. They want to build a longer term strategic plan. So I kind of feel out what's the near term need, and then we model according to that.
Okay, so very interesting. So, do you have any other points that you wanted to cover as part of this episode that you could not cover?
I mean, that's kind of the majority of it. Again, my brain always goes into the spreadsheet, the three-statement model. That's
Yeah,
kind of my bread and butter. And I feel like as a finance professional or a CFO or even an owner, if you can get a grasp on that concept of the
yeah,
three-statement model, you will inherently teach yourself the sophistication needed when you want to go solicit capital at the investor level. So I model a lot of my work around that today. I have courses around that because I just think that is the most important thing that you can learn in finance, and everything else kind of falls into place if you understand that structure.
okay, very cool. Any other closing advice for our listeners by any chance?
I would just say keep it simple.
Keep it
I think
simple.
we talk about financial models. They can get so complicated just for complication's sake. I've built plenty of models like that that are far too complicated. They break my brain, they break my computer, and everything else. Try to keep it simple. Focus on the 80/20 of the business. It's going
Yeah,
to be, the revenue, the gross margin, the headcount, and the cash. And if you can get in essence, a decent reading on those, you will be much better off than trying to be overly intricate and getting lost in the weeds. So try to keep the modeling process as simple as you can because the model is not the business. The model is just an abstract representation of what we think we might do. People still have to go out and actually do the work and do the operations effort to achieve those financial results. So keep it just complicated enough that it's like accurate and just simple enough that you can go out and actually get the stuff done and make the decisions.
Yeah, could not agree more. And my personal takeaway from this conversation is going to be that if you don't have the FP&A process, then you are definitely missing out and you are not going to have the insights that you are going to be needing to run your business. On that note, Chris, I really want to thank you for your time. This has been a powerful episode.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Sam. I'm really glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you'd like to learn more about Chris, head over to missioncapitalco.com. It's missioncapitalco.com. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.